All right. Good. I feel like I'm caught in the food trap. I'm having a I'm having a millennial pause where I never know what to say in the beginning. So I always say, "Oh, good morning," and then I realize it's not morning everywhere, and then I don't know where to go. Anyways, I've been reading. Some of you may know I've been reading Kierkegaard's spiritual writings, um, and it's a wonderful book. It really is. It's a wonderful compilation of Kierkegaard's um, own spiritual kind of tackling. But Kierkegaard says something very interesting, and I think we can benefit from this exposition. We can take something important from what Kierkegaard is saying. But first, I like to give a little bit of an anecdote to um, why I wanted to talk about Kierkegaard and advice giving. Recently, uh, in my one of my cl- recently in one of my classes, we had to discuss, and I'm taking a psychology of religion class. We had to talk about two models of suffering, two models of suffering, and the two models of suffering that was presented um, on the unit was that there is a negative model of suffering, which is you could say is probably more understood as the secular um, understanding of suffering, where you want to avoid suffering. Suffering is kind of bad. And then you have the more positive model of suffering, which is, uh, intangible from religion, basically, right? At least these are the arguments being presented, right? That the positive model of suffering is related to the religious sphere, and that the negative model of suffering is related to the more secular sphere. What's difficult about dividing this up with the positive model with religion of suffering and the negative model um, with secularism is that actually Davies Davies is a psychologist that observed his own experience with what we would call the secularization thesis, right? The secularization thesis is this idea that everything is becoming more secularized and that we're becoming more irreligious, right? That's called the secularization theory. However, he starts wondering whether that is actually true, and so he decided to experiment with, like, does taking psychiatric medicine make you more irreligious? Does it make you want to leave your religion? Um, and anyways, the conclusion that he kind of discovered was that, well, it's actually not very clear if we do if we are actually, if these psychiatric drugs are promoting a kind of secularism and making people leave religion, right? There's a case study that he found where it was literally called the Prozac Christians, right? That was like the whole category. These Christians that are on depressive medications and so on. So okay, so now that you guys kind of have like the background, a little bit of what is going on with what I'm about to say, is that in class we had this discussion between the negative model of suffering and the positive model of suffering. And one of the things that we stumbled upon in the discussion within my own group in class is that we fell upon something that was kind of irreconcilable. Like we couldn't reconcile um, this tension between the the negative model of suffering and the positive model of suffering. And we try to reconcile it because we try to think about cases where the negative model of suffering is kind of justified, right? That the person wants to avoid suffering, right? Um, and funny enough, ironically, everybody in my group was kind of advertising for the positive model of suffering, right? Like, yes, you must face your anxiety, you must face all this other stuff. Um, and I'm also typically in that line of thought as well, that you need to just confront what you need to confront. But then there was somebody that kind of proposed, you know, that it was so kind of unnecessary. Like, why are you trying to force me to face something? Um, in some ways, I couldn't help but think of Lacan in this moment a little bit, where it's like the person wants to stay with their symptom, right? They want to be with their symptom, and you cannot convince them otherwise. And so this is where I think Kierkegaard helps us a little bit in understanding this. So I will try to read just like a section or so, and and because Kierkegaard gives a lot of, what I like about Kierkegaard is that he gives a lot of it gets confusing with Kierkegaard sometimes when you encounter him, because he shares a lot of perspectives within the same position, meaning like he's entertaining multiple interpretations of when somebody is suffering. And so this is the part that I'm going to read. And so this is what the context of this is. Kierkegaard is talking about the gospel, the Christian gospel, and how it's kind of made for the anxious, has the anxious in mind. But I think there is something important to take with us when we read these passages from Kierkegaard, because it doesn't have to just be tied to this kind of like theological example. So Kierkegaard says something like this, right? In context to the gospel, but again, I'm going to show how we can extrapolate this. So Kierkegaard says something like this. He goes, "For everyone who sorrows, and especially when their grief has penetrated more deeply or for longer into their soul, is perhaps also tempted to impatience, and does not want to hear what others have to say about comfort and hope. Perhaps, perhaps those who sorrow are wrong in that regard. They are too impatient when it seems to them that no human being can speak to the point about what grieves them, for they think the happy do not understand them. And when those who are strong offer comfort, they seem precisely to place themselves far above them by doing so, while what other anxiety sufferers have to offer only depresses them further." So let's pause for a second on this topic, because Kierkegaard is saying something really, really fascinating here. He's saying he's capturing the moment of when you are deeply struggling with something, and one of the hardest problems with struggling with something, suffering with something, is that, one, you always feel like when you share it with somebody, that they don't understand, right? They don't understand, and so you sort of dismiss their offerings of comfort and advice, right? And this is the interesting part that Kierkegaard says to follow this up with. He says, but then you go to the anxiety sufferers, right? The people that can relate to you. And all they offer is more sorrow, more depression, right? It only confirms your suffering. Like, yes, you understand. And then you continue to mourn it. Like you basically Kierkegaard is saying like you dismiss the comfort of those that are strong and trying to give you a advice, but you feel like they don't understand, so you dismiss them. And then, but then Kierkegaard is saying, but the other option doesn't help you either, right? Because the other option of the people that suffer like you, they only depress you further, right? This is what Kierkegaard is saying. They only, so in some ways it's like the others don't understand, but then the ones that do understand, they don't help you either. They just become a participant in your um, in your sorrows, right? And so this is what Kierkegaard says next. He's like, so if that's how it is, then it's best to look for other teachers who do not address us in such a way as to show they don't understand, whose exhortations don't contain some secret approach, who do not look at us judgingly, and whose comfort does not serve more to stir us up than to calm us down. So again, Kierkegaard is addressing something so important here, and I think it's really important because we take advice giving as an opportunity to share our wisdom, our insights, and immediately that is kind of off-putting because there is something about the advice giver that has a little bit of a hero's complex, right? That they are waiting for you to say something that you're struggling with so they can tell you how to overcome it, right? Oh, this is the formula, this is what I did, and all this stuff, right? And so Kierkegaard is saying the moment that you play that game, the moment that you give that proposal, you are already not understanding. You're driving the one who is suffering from anxiety and so on. You're driving him away, right? And but then to turn to the one that understands you, that also suffers like you. Kierkegaard is saying that this turning to the one that understands you through the suffering doesn't help you either. It only depresses you further, basically, right? It's like this kind of like it's almost like if you were both like nihilists, like yes, you're right, everything's meaningless, and he's like, oh yes, I know everything's meaningless, and you guys sort of like mourn together in this kind of thing. So Kierkegaard is giving us a middle position here, where he's saying that if you just try to not act like if you're giving some type of solution to their issue, if you act like you're not trying to either alleviate them of their suffering or to perpetuate their suffering or to confirm their suffering, he said, as long as if you just state, basically, this is what Kierkegaard is basically saying, if you just state what you have to say, rather than trying to act like you have the solution, um, there is a way to kind of like honor this. You're doing more of an honor to the person, right? And so Kierkegaard, adds more to this. He says, it is to such teachers that the gospel for the anxious directs the sorrowful to the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. In relation to these teachers, so cheap that they ask for neither money nor deference, no misunderstanding is possible because they keep silent out of consideration for the anxious. For it is from speaking that all misunderstanding arises, which can be more precisely explained by noting that all speaking, especially speaking in company, implies an element of comparison. So this is very important. Like what Kierkegaard is saying is like this is the example that he gives, right? When somebody says, cheer up, right? He says, oh, just cheer up, right? Kierkegaard is saying that when somebody hears those words, those cheer up, he's saying that immediately you start comparing, right? And that you start interpreting this advice as saying the other person is telling you to be as strong as me, be as happy as I am. And it's kind of inevitable. Like this is what Kierkegaard is saying. He's like, it's kind of inevitable that the comparison occurs because when somebody gives you that kind of advice, there's a kind of like disgust to it in there, right? Even though he's not explicitly saying this, but there's a kind of disgust when somebody is receiving advice because Kierkegaard is saying that you can't help but compare. When somebody says be happy, immediately what is heard is that it's be as happy as I am, be as cheerful as I am, be as strong as I am. And Kierkegaard is saying like this is inevitable. You're going to have this kind of comparison. It's because of one, the fact that we're speaking, and two, it's because we are in company of each other. And so he continues, right? He says, so when the happy person says cheer up to someone who is suffering from anxiety, this also implies be happy as I am. And when the strong person says be strong, then he is understood as meaning in the same way as I am. And then this is the twist with Kierkegaard. He's like, but silence honors anxiety. And the anxious person, as Job's friends did then, out of respect, they sat silently with the sufferer and thus showed their respect. So Kierkegaard is kind of giving us he's giving us an alternative to this dilemma of advice giving, right? He's saying that advice giving comes with a kind of misunderstanding. And it's very hard to brush off this understanding because if you say anything of comfort, it only reflects yourself, basically, right? Like the person that is suffering sees that reflection, right? He's basically, they understand that basically what you're saying is to be as strong as I am, to be as smart as I am, to overcome just like I did, right? That's what Kierkegaard is saying. And so in this case, it is better, Kierkegaard might be saying, to just honor it, to just be silent, to possibly just not say anything at all. Don't allow them to confirm their suffering as to perpetuate it, but then don't allow to try to negate their suffering, to try to dismiss their suffering. And so I say all of this to go back to the original anecdote that I said before with these two models of suffering that we were presented in class, where it was the positive model of suffering and the negative model of suffering. And Kierkegaard helped me realize, why is this irreconcilable? And what's so irreconcilable about it is that when disagreements were happening between the negative models of suffering and the positive models of suffering, and this is obviously this is probably a big philosophy argument too, because a lot of the arguments that I've perpetuated, a lot of the arguments that my own peers have perpetuated is, how do we get people to face their suffering? right? How do we get people to face anxiety? How do we get people to encounter it and take it head on, right? But you see, what Kierkegaard is saying is, no, don't. Don't do that. Because it actually works against you. It's better that you honor it. And so when I started thinking about this issue between how do we use the negative model of suffering, what is the utility of the negative model of suffering, and the positive model of suffering, um, already there is a kind of dangerous position with doing that, meaning like some of the underlying logic of facing your anxiety, of encountering it and taking it head on, is that it kind of has this tone of in order for you to be functional like me, you have to take it on, right? And what is daunting about what Kierkegaard is presenting to us is that he's basically saying it's nice that you can have intentions to help someone, um, want to face anxiety and encourage them to have the courage to encounter what they need to encounter. He's like, that's nice and all, but I just want to let you know that the person doesn't interpret it that way. They interpret it in such a way that it actually works against you when you say those very words, right? And it's this issue of comparison that arises just kind of unnaturally, because when somebody is speaking, you clearly see that there's a difference between me and them. And the moment that this difference is spotted, comparison sort of just naturally arises, right? This person is handling it well. I'm not handling it well. This person is trying to tell me to handle it well, but that's because they're trying to say, be like me, right? So Kierkegaard is entertaining the perspective of the one that's suffering. And then he's also trying to show the ones that want to give advice and say, look, you are working against yourself in this. It's already a loss. The moment you try, and he's trying to reveal the irony of this, like the very idea that you're trying to give advice works against you in this case, right? Now, of course, there's exceptions to this. I don't think Kierkegaard is saying that we should just not give advice, but I think implicitly it might be saying what Kierkegaard might be saying more implicitly is that we must try to not give advice when not prompted to give advice. And so we can look at that not promptness as a sort of like silence that must be respected. Like if you're not prompted to give advice, then it is best to say silent as such, right? And what's interesting, what gets more complex about this passage, and this is why I had to do a video about this, because there is so much to say about what Kierkegaard is saying, and there's so much to think about and break down and entertain with what Kierkegaard is saying, is that he may also be saying that even if you suffer like the one that is suffering, that you may also want to refrain from confirming or stirring up his suffering in such a way that he continues to view it negatively, right? So I think Kierkegaard is also saying that you should probably refrain from that too, even if you relate. Um, and and then he's obviously saying the opposite with saying the same thing with the ones that want to give advice, want to bring comfort. He's like, you may be working against yourself here, right? And so when I look back about that debate between the negative model of suffering and the positive model of suffering, I think Kierkegaard takes the most uh, bold position by saying whatever the person is saying, you must honor it, right? But to honor it in such a way that you do not infiltrate the person's suffering, meaning that you do not try to give them comfort and that you do not try to perpetuate the suffering by saying like yes everything's nihilistic, yes everything is so hard and horrible. Like you do not perpetuate that way either. So I think Kierkegaard is saying that we need to find a way to honor what is being said when it is said. um, and his most, you could say his middle position, I don't like using this word, but his middle position is to not say anything, right? To simply honor it. To not say to the person, oh, I feel like that's a very negative model of suffering. To avoid suffering is such a bad thing. Because this is the really important part here. It's not that that's bad advice. That's not what I think. This is the difference, right? Kierkegaard is not saying that that is bad advice. I think what Kierkegaard is trying to tell us is that even if it's good advice, the irony is that it becomes bad advice. Why? Because the person who you are giving advice to cannot help but compare themselves to you. So basically they see that all you're saying is to be as strong as me, to be as happy as me, to do what I did to overcome the problem, right? And that is what is difficult with this notion of advice giving, or merely just to be there to comfort them, right? Because to comfort them you confirm them, and that way you never entertain a new perspective. But then trying to promote a new perspective is also dangerous, because obviously they won't entertain it, because all you're saying is the one that is receiving the advice, all they interpret that is your projection, basically your projection onto them. And so in this case they say you don't understand, right? But again, like I said, I don't think Kierkegaard I think it's very easy to interpret this passage and say, okay, we won't give advice. I don't think that is what Kierkegaard is saying. I think what Kierkegaard is saying is that we must understand to not give advice without being prompted to do so. So if we want to understand this, I think in a healthier fashion, instead of taking it like don't give advice, don't say anything, to take it like this, to I think what he's trying to do is reorder the way that we approach somebody that is suffering, meaning that we should not try to feel this pressing need to immediately comfort or immediately try to um, perpetuate their suffering. Kierkegaard is saying is to honor it, and then honor it until prompted to do otherwise, right? Honor it until you're prompted to do otherwise, meaning like if somebody is genuinely seeking advice, then this is the moment that you can say something. But if they are not genuinely seeking advice, then Kierkegaard is saying it's best to not say anything, because it will not work, right? The individual has to prompt you for advice. And so I think that's a very important lesson um, for us, because I think Kierkegaard is getting at a very problematic thing with our familial relations, our personal relations with friends. We all have friends like this, and we all have family members like this, where one is very quick to give advice, and some others are very quick to just affirm your suffering, right? And you can see how neither of these positions are sometimes helpful. Neither of these positions are helpful, not necessarily beneficial. So Kierkegaard is, in my opinion, going against the grain of wanting to give advice when not prompted, and also going against the grain of wanting to instantly comfort them by affirming their suffering in that way. And Kierkegaard saying it's actually almost what is more true is to honor it, right? To say nothing until prompted so, right? Because then you do risk kind of projecting onto the subject, and the subject, it's almost like what Kierkegaard is saying, the subject sees that. He sees that bullshit, right? He sees it, especially if it's counter to their suffering, counter to what they know. But it becomes more difficult for them to see it if you merely affirm it in such a way that they continue to suffer in that way. So in this case, it's better to honor it, and it does give a deep thought to what does it mean to honor. It does raise that question: what does it mean to really honor someone, and without being too quick to pull the trigger on all the resources of our intellectual knowledge and everything else. And and if I'm being honest with myself, I think philosophy has always carried that risk. Philosophy always cushions itself with its advice giving, basically, right? Face your suffering, have courage, take it on. That is some of the danger, and sometimes we get caught up in being so quick to share people our philosophical insights, and but Kierkegaard is basically saying what you risk in doing that is you risk the person interpreting you as saying, oh, be like me, be intellectual like me, be a well-read person like me, understand suffering like me. You see how already Kierkegaard is pointing out the subliminal kind of messaging that the that the reader is looking into, that the reader is sort of perpetuating when hearing your advice. He's sort of seeing subliminal messages that aren't maybe not necessarily there, but that's how he sees it. That's how the person receiving the advice sees it, and that is what Kierkegaard is trying to make us understand. Is like, you want to give advice, but you should hold on to that until you are prompted, because it's not going to work. It's not going to be convincing. You're not going to convince anyone, because all the person can see is that sort of self-reflection of superiority, basically. And Kierkegaard saying it's not what is intended. It's not what is intended. It's what is interpreted. And so this really puts a lot of pressure, and it makes us think again about. It makes us think twice about giving advice, and it makes us think twice about wanting to immediately comfort them by affirming their view and their perspective. It really makes us think twice about doing these things, because Kierkegaard is saying that there's elements to both of these options that are equally harmful, but on opposite spectrums. So the solution is to honor first, and then I think we can safely say that we can honor first, and then, if prompted, give our what we think is good advice. You know, in my opinion, advice giving goes better off if you say something like, you know, this is what I did. I don't know if that works for you. I don't know if you want to entertain that, perspective, but this is how I overcame it, and that's something that you might consider. You know, in my opinion, those kind of positional advice giving is always better because you're not pressuring the person to um, necessarily take the advice. You're sort of just leaving it suspended, right? You're leaving it suspended. You're adding to their possibilities of responding. And I think if there were an ethical rule to advice giving, it should be that kind of maxim that I am simply offering. I am simply offering. And I think maybe that is probably one of the problematic structures with giving advice is that ad- giving advice should be a kind of like offering, not a demand, an offering. I am offering this, and you can choose to take it or not take it, but I am offering this, and there is no wrong answer to this offering. You, out of pure honor, I give this to you, and you can choose to accept it, or you can choose to continue, right? And I think that is the way to be silent, right? We don't have to interpret what Kierkegaard is saying as a literal silence, but a kind of silence of I am not pushing anything onto you, and I am not affirming anything for you. I am simply offering. I am simply offering for the sake of offering, not to tell you that this is the way you should respond, and so on. And I think that is a way to be silent about the offering, to be silent about the gift that you want to give. Um, and yeah, I think that's so. It's a very important move. I think, I personally think it's a very important um, concept that Kierkegaard is offering to us. Right? He's offering to it to us, and it also makes me think about philosophy that we don't have to accept anything from philosophy, but there's a way to look at how thinkers are talking about what thinkers are saying and what thinkers are um, projecting and so on, is that we can look at it in a way that they're offering. They are offering something. And it may not come off that way because obviously they may be persisting, they may be insisting. Um, but there's a way that we can approach philosophy in the regard that every thinker is merely offering despite their insistence. They're merely offering. And if we interpret that way, I think we can have perhaps a more healthy relationship with philosophy and with other thinkers that really at the end of the day, it is genuinely an offering. An offering. The gift is what is being offered here. And I think Kierkegaard really is capitalizing on this idea of the gift. And to be honest, actually, most of this book in the beginning is about Kierkegaard talking about the gift and how we're even the capacity that you have for sympathy. Kierkegaard says that is a gift. That is a gift that you don't own. So do not be so foolish to think that that is something that you possess. That in fact you are lower than your advice and you are lower than your capacity for sympathy. Um, And of course, Kierkegaard is playing off of this idea that we're all equal before God, but the way that he plays with this concept of equal before God, and we don't even have to take this theologically serious, like, if you're not a Christian or anything, for example, there's a way to read Kierkegaard to understand that everything you do is an offering. And even what you think is yours is not really yours. It is an offering, right? Even sharing your experiences is a kind of offering. Like, for example, you didn't choose your experiences, so to speak. You chose to interpret them in a certain way, sure. But you didn't choose your experiences, not the way that you think. You didn't really choose your experiences. You didn't choose to have a mother that you disagreed with, but you did choose to interpret it in a kind of way. But you didn't choose those interactions. Of course, there's an ironic feedback loop where it's like you interpret something and then it feels like you choose your experience, but you didn't. It was your interpretation that you chose that feeds into the illusion that you chose a kind of specific experience. But you don't choose it. So in some ways, Kierkegaard is saying that what you have is not really what you have, but what you have is a gift, um, is an offering that can be given to others, and they are in no obligation to take it, to appreciate it, because one, it's not yours. This is the irony, right? It's not yours. So even if they do reject it, what is being rejected? Because it's not yours. It's a gift. It's an offering. So yeah, I share this with you guys, because I thought it was fundamentally fascinating to to really, um, one, try to make this relatable, and and present it as an offering, an offering on advice giving and receiving. But yeah, all right. Yeah, so thank you guys for watching. All right, take care.